Today we're going to talk about the Keynesian model for the macroeconomy. Well, last time we talked about the classical model, and we need a little history lesson first. The classical model was kind of the predominant way of thinking between 1776 and the Great Depression. It had been refined a good deal. There were a number of people who wrote after Adam Smith, and there'd been a lot added to it between Adam Smith and the 1930s. But it was still widely believed among economists that if an economy was left alone for long enough, it would tend to be self-regulating. Ultimately, it would tend toward a full employment natural rate of real GDP. And so any problems that you found in the economy were easily explained as problems that were occasioned by bad policy. The government had the bad habit of getting involved in the economy, and as a result we had these problems that were generated by their involvement. That came into question, obviously, in the Great Depression. One of the things that was a side effect of that was that the U.S., and we'll talk primarily about the U.S. experience, although the Great Depression was actually an experience that was worldwide. The U.S. experience was that all politicians believed that budgets had to be balanced, that government needed to continuously find ways to reduce its footprint in the economy. But as we moved into a depression and things got worse and worse and worse, we began to question whether that was really a good explanation or not. And 3 or 4 years in, we began to know something's not right here. The economy's not going back to where it needs to go back to. We had 30% of our population without a job that we know about, and there may have been even more than that. Prices on goods and services were actually falling. There were factories being closed. People were doing without and looking for work any and everywhere they could and so forth. And it was obvious that the economy was not improving. And so we needed a new explanation. That explanation came in the form of John Maynard Keynes and is known as Keynesian economics. Now, much of what we're going to say about this has been improved upon and expanded in later years. Much of what we're going to say wasn't original to Keynes. Other people have improved on his original theory, but it's still the case that it's known as Keynesian economics. So today our topic is Keynesian economic theory, and it really came into being as of 1936. The beginning work was entitled The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Keynes was widely ridiculed and not believed by economists of the day, primarily because his ideas were so very different from the classical theory and from what most economists had been taught. One of the first things that Keynes said was that Say's law may not necessarily hold. And I will remind you that Say's law says that supply creates its own demand. It also has a component of it known as the loanable funds theory, which says that interest rates adjust so that ultimately savings and investment are in equilibrium. What Keynes identified was expectations affect both of these things. That is, when people begin to not feel so certain about their future, they may not want to invest no matter what the interest rate is. And that was very much the case during the Great Depression. Why would anyone invest in new plant and equipment during the Great Depression when much of the plant and equipment they already had was sitting idle anyway? So despite the fact that the interest rate was actually negative for most of the Great Depression, there really wasn't any investment ongoing. And the reason there wasn't any investment ongoing is you really didn't need it. There were so many plants that were sitting idle with the gates locked, the people had been let go, and the machinery was sitting there rusting away. There really wasn't any reason to build new plant and equipment. If you had opened the plants and started manufacturing goods, there was nobody to sell them to. People didn't have money, so people couldn't buy the goods or services. So Keynes was the first to identify the psychological piece of macroeconomics. In other words, it doesn't just depend on prices, it also depends on psychology. And we see that even today. As people get more pessimistic about their future, their consumption or their buying habits change, their savings habits change, and so forth. And Keynes was the first one to say you can't just look at just prices. You've got to look at what people are predicting about the future. That's also very much the case in terms of investment as well. People don't invest when they're not sure. Keynes also said that wages are not fully flexible. I'll remind you that in the case of the classical system, the way a recessionary gap is closed is that people lower their wage rate, and this shifts the aggregate supply curve. So we had, in our example before, we said you're paying $50 a day to your workers to work, and people come along since they're unemployed and say, I'll work for 40. And that not only reduces their wage, but it reduces other people's wage. Keynes was the first to say that wages are sticky, which means they're perfectly happy to go up in wages, but they tend not to want to go down in wages. Now, if these wage rates don't change, the result is the recessionary gap won't change. And so we won't get this shift to the right, and the economy might be stuck at less than its full potential for long periods of time. And in fact, that's precisely what Keynes said to FDR. FDR asked Keynes, well, how long before this thing solves itself? And Keynes says it may never solve itself. It may stay at this level forever. And FDR believed he was a crazy man, but nevertheless, that was the case. If we don't get a shift to the right, then we're going to have to use something else to move back to our potential. And Keynes said perhaps what we want to do is increase aggregate demand. If we want to move to a new location, if we want to move to a new equilibrium, we could depend on aggregate supply to move, or we could manually move, in a sense, aggregate demand. And that's precisely what he advocated. So Keynes emphasizes the spending side as the driving force in the economy, whereas the classicals emphasize the supply side. In the classical theory, all policy is aimed at fostering supply, doing things that cause people to make more goods and services, help out businesses, make all sorts of policies and so forth that foster businesses. In the Keynesian theory, the emphasis is on the spending side. In both cases, we're attempting to affect the equilibrium of total expenditures, but it's a difference in terms of how you get to that point. So here's where we were before. The numbers aren't on here, but the natural rate is at $11 trillion, and that's at this point. And suppose we're stuck temporarily over here at 10.5, so we're below our full employment equilibrium, although not drastically below our full employment equilibrium. Notice that in order to get to what we essentially want to do is to get to this point right here, or we want to get over to this level here. We could do that one of two ways. We could either move this curve, which is what the classical theory does, or we could move this curve, which is what the Keynesian theory does. And essentially, what Keynes says is do something that increases aggregate demand. So Keynes actually advocated to FDR doing all of the sorts of programs which ultimately we ended up doing. That is, for the government to put to work all of the unemployed people. And so you got such things as the WPA and the CCC and all of those various different programs. The intention being put the people back to work. When the people have income, the people will spend their money, and when they spend their money, we'll get to our real potential. Now, this graph, as you notice, is very different from the other one. In the classical theory, this curve moves, that is, aggregate supply moves. In this graph, the aggregate demand has moved. We've done something that encouraged aggregate demand to increase. And in fact, that was exactly what happened in our economy. We never fully embraced this idea, and in fact, it had many potential problems in terms of getting it passed through Congress and so forth, because again, as I said to begin with, all politicians believed that budgets needed to be balanced every year. And so we piddled at it a little bit and things got a little better, and then we'd back off and things would get worse again, and then we would start again and things would get a little better, and then we'd back off and things would get worse again. But it was the case in our economy that as we did more and more to foster aggregate demand, things got better. What ultimately fixed it? Well, ultimately World War II fixed it, and that was a tremendous impact in terms of spending. Essentially, initially we built lots of munitions and sold them to other countries, but ultimately we built lots of munitions and used them ourselves. And so ultimately World War II fixed the problem for us. Important for us to understand that since aggregate demand is the thing that we're most interested in, the easiest way of remedying any shortcomings, that is, if we have a recessionary gap and we'd like to move the economy forward, because if we can move the economy forward, what it'll do is fully employ the entire economy. In order to do that, the easiest way to do it is to do something that affects consumption. Since consumption is roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of the total expenditure in our economy, if we can do anything which will affect consumption, then we can have a tremendous impact. Now, Keynes was the first to say that consumption doesn't depend on price levels. What we'd essentially done is taken individual markets and just kind of extended them out to everything else. And so we believed that consumption depended on the price level. Keynes said, no, consumption doesn't depend on the price level. Consumption depends on the income level. That is, if we take out taxes, then the disposable income, the income that is available for individuals to spend, is going to be either spent or saved. And there's actually a relationship between the level of income and the level of consumption, or another way of looking at it is the level of income and the level of savings. So we might have an individual family, and we might look at what happens in this family at various different monthly incomes. So we have on the left column, we have disposable income, and you see it goes up by roughly $3,000 each time. So if in this particular family, if they have $3,000 of income, then they'll spend $6,600. If they have $6,000 of income, then they spend $8,400. If they have $9,000 of income, then they spend $10,200. If they have $12,000, they spend $12,000, and you see how those numbers change. Notice that even at lower incomes, they actually spend more than they have coming in income. Now, how is that possible? Well, obviously it's possible by what economists would refer to as dissaving. In other words, they're drawing down out of a savings account, or they're financing it through borrowing or something of that sort. They're finding the money other places. Why would that be the case? Well, there's a minimum level, an unalterable minimum below which people can't go. If they have zero income, they'll still consume some, because you have to have enough to eat, and you have to have a place to stay, and you have to have clothes and those sorts of things. Notice for this particular family, their break-even level is $12,000. Once they get to $12,000, they receive $12,000 and they consume $12,000. Now, it may not be really obvious, but there actually is a pattern to how these people are spending money. As this changes by $3,000, this changes by $1,800. And the same pattern is followed throughout as they go from this level to this level. Again, it changes by $1,800. That is known as their marginal propensity to consume. It is the percentage of their income that they spend. We could actually define a consumption function for them. In other words, we could draw a function that says, based on various different income levels, how much will they consume? And these are actually the numbers from the previous graph. And you'll see that if you extend this on down, there's an irreducible minimum somewhere down, looks like about $5,600, $5,400. That's the minimum amount they can get by on a monthly basis or whatever it is. And you'll see that this is actually a direct relationship. As income goes up, their spending goes up as well. We could have a parallel function, or a function that is the other side of this same function, and it would be a savings function, and it would actually be below zero at all numbers lower than 12,000, and then it would come up and break the plane of zero at 12,000, and then it would be positive above that. And if you look back at these numbers, you can see that at $18,000 they would have, $2,400 in savings and so forth. So you could actually define a different function which is related to their savings level. This marginal propensity to consume, which I mentioned a second ago, is actually the slope of that function. It answers the question, if I give this family another dollar of income, how much of that do they spend? And the backside of it is their marginal propensity to save, which is how much of it do they save. It's equal to the change in consumption divided by the change in income. Change in consumption divided by the change in income. In the case of our particular family, that would be $1,800 divided by $3,000, and it would give you the number which represents what percentage of their income do they spend out of each additional dollar. Now, if we put a 45-degree angle on that, then we will find the point at which they break even. And we know that point's $12,000. That's the point at which they consume everything that they take in, and that would simply identify for us that point at which they break even. At points below that, at points short of that, this distance, this difference here is the amount of savings, and at points beyond it, this distance, this difference is the amount of savings. So this is the point at which savings is equal to zero. Any point beyond this, savings is positive. Any point before this, savings is negative. And so it actually identifies for us the break-even point. And that's true of all 45-degree lines. They simply split that quadrant into two equal-sized pieces, or show you the points where the two numbers are equal to one another. Now, in the Keynesian model, of course, this is going to determine roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of the total output, the total amount of real GDP, if we do this for not just our family, but for all families. And we could add to that the other portions, and we could actually end up with an expenditures curve. In order to do that, we'd first have to make the assumption that consumption is directly related to the disposable income, which is what we just said. The levels of investment, government purchases, and net exports are what economists refer to as autonomous. And autonomous simply means that they're determined by outside of our system by some other forces. Does that make sense? Well, what do government expenditures depend on? Well, they depend on a political process, and we can't really put that on one of the axes, and so therefore they are autonomous. They are determined outside the model. The level of investment depends on the return on investment and also the interest rates. Those two, once again, are not a part of the income, and so they're autonomous. What happens in terms of net exports? Well, that depends on the exchange rate between our currency and other currencies, and it depends on how well things are going in other countries. So once again, it's autonomous. It comes to us from somewhere else. So we simply added on to this graph. So you see here a schedule, and you'll notice that the government expenditures are determined outside the system. They are set at 1900. They don't change no matter what happens in terms of real GDP. You see that investment too is set externally, is set outside the system, doesn't change, doesn't depend on what real GDP is, and the same thing for net exports. And so we find a highlighted portion here where the level of GDP is equal to the total expenditures. And that would look, if we plotted that, it would look something like this. So this is just simply the numbers from the previous schedule. And then the equilibrium would occur at the point where total expenditures equal total production. Total expenditures equals the real GDP, or using the technology we used a second ago, it would be the point where the 45-degree line, the 45-degree angle line actually intersects with that line. So that would look like the following. And this just is the graph of the schedule that we had a second ago. Here's the 45-degree line. This is the total expenditures line. You could think of this as C plus I plus G plus X sub n. And the equilibrium GDP occurs at 10.5 trillion. That's the point at which what we're producing equals what's being purchased. So we have an equilibrium there in the sense that the production level and the sales level are the same. The slope of this line, since we simply added together the consumption function plus an autonomous investment plus an autonomous government plus an autonomous net exports, we essentially have a line which is sloped by the exact same amount as the consumption function, because all of those others didn't change the slope at all. Now, the point that Keynes is making here is this is equilibrium in the sense that there's no tendency for it to change, but it might not be equilibrium in the sense that it's full employment. So equilibrium simply means equilibrium. It tends to stay there. It does not mean it's equilibrium in the sense of it's a point that we're satisfied with. If, for some reason or other, we were to move away from equilibrium, if total expenditures were to be greater than real GDP, then business people would notice that. And the reason they would notice it is their inventories would be falling. And if their inventories fell, then they would increase their production. And so we would go back to an equilibrium GDP. On the other hand, if total expenditures were less than what was being produced, then inventories would actually increase. Again, we have a signal to the producers, and they would decrease their production, and we would go back to an equilibrium GDP. So the ideal level, the level that we're going to get to, might not necessarily be the natural level. If it's less than the natural level, then we have a recessionary gap. If it's more than the natural level, then we have an inflationary gap. So if the natural level is there and we are at this point, we have a recessionary gap. The problem here is that there's not enough spending. And so what we need to do is to find a way of, well, this is the opposite case. In this case, we have an inflationary gap because we have too much spending. And you can see from going from one to the other that what we need to do is to find a way of shifting that curve. This would be the perfect place because we're at the natural real GDP. In order to get there, the easiest way to do it is to simply change one of the components of total expenditures. We could change consumption, we could change investment, we could change government purchases, or we could change net exports in order to get there. There's one of those that we have real easy control over, however, and that is government purchases. So if we were at 10.5 and we'd like to get to a different place, say 10.8, then what we could do is to find a way of actually moving this total expenditures curve up. And notice that we move the curve up slightly, but it ends up moving real GDP a good little ways. Notice that the gap between these two curves is smaller than the gap between the two equilibrium points. That is, the line only moves up a slight amount, but the result is a dramatic increase in real GDP. This gap is only this change in investment. In this case, what we're doing is we're changing investment, and we change investment by 120, and the result is a change in GDP of 300. This is known as the multiplier effect. Any changes in one of the components of total expenditures is multiplied in terms of how much it changes real GDP. So we get a lot of bang for our buck. Why is that so? Well, the reason it's so is when you expend money, suppose you spend $100. That $100 is income to someone. Whoever that someone is going to spend what you've given them. They may take some out and save it, but the majority of it they're actually going to spend. When they spend it, it becomes income to somebody else. This other somebody else is going to spend the majority of it. They may save a little bit of it, but they're going to spend the majority of it. So your spending actually has a ripple effect. It's very similar to throwing a rock in a pond. It starts off at one location, but then it affects somebody else, who affects somebody else, who affects somebody else. And that's known as the multiplier effect. The expenditure, in our case, the change of investment by 120 actually gave rise to 300 in total change of real GDP. And you see this effect happen oftentimes in communities as well. When a plant closes, it not only affects the people who work in the plant, but it affects all of the people who help those people or who sell goods and services to those people. If a plant closes, it usually closes the restaurant across the street and the laundry down the street and so forth and so on. And this is known as the multiplier effect. It's a multiple impact of any changes in expenditures. Because that's initially autonomous, it has a chain reaction throughout the economy. Now, how much is that? Well, it's actually equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. And the idea here is, I said when you spend $100, the person you spend it with sees that as income. They take a little out of it and save it, but then they spend the rest. So essentially what we're calculating here is how many times can you take that little bit out before you eventually wipe out the original amount. So the change in real GDP is the change in total expenditures times this multiplier, and that gives you what the total amount of change in real GDP is. In other words, what is the total value of that ripple effect or that change effect? And that total value is equal to whatever you start off with times the multiplier. So the size of the multiplier, of course, depends on the marginal propensity to consume. The greater the marginal propensity to consume, the larger the multiplier. The smaller the marginal propensity to consume, the smaller the multiplier. Oh yes, I'm glad they reminded us that the multiplier actually works both ways. It also is the case, as we were saying a second ago, if a plant closes, it has a multiple effect, and that's exactly what was going on during the Depression. It wasn't just the plant, just the workers who worked in a particular plant whose jobs were affected. It was all of the people that supported them. And that'll do it for today. We're going to come back next time and we're going to talk about how we might use this theory to somehow fix the problem that we had in the Great Depression. Essentially what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about fiscal policy. And fiscal policy are changes in government expenditures or government taxes in order to try to solve a problem that we have in our economy. It's often couched as fixing a recessionary gap or fixing a case in which we have insufficient total expenditures, but it could be used the other way too. It could be used to reduce prices or to get us back to a point that's more manageable, that's more realistic for our economy. I want to remind you that the major thing you should see here today is that in the classical theory, it's all about aggregate supply. In the Keynesian theory, it's all about aggregate demand. Notice we haven't said anything about affecting wage rates other than to say that they are unlikely to go down. We haven't said anything about affecting wage rates or reducing interest rates or anything of that sort. We've been all keyed in on the aggregate demand side. We've been interested in total expenditures. And so that was one of the big innovations or one of the big new findings, the big change of focus that Keynes brought to us. Next time, we'll put these two together and see if there's a way that we can do a little better job of controlling our economy. We'll see you next time.